Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Delighted to have you all here. I'm Alex Pollock of AEI, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our conference on Does the FDIC's single point of entry strategy eliminate too big to fail? Well, the short answer is no. But you're here to consider the longer answer, the specific arguments, and the closely reasoned analysis of my colleagues Peter Wallison and Paul Kupiec about why no is indeed the correct answer. When the single point of entry, or SPOE, was announced, it got a great many favorable comments, but on consideration, it has a lot of problems. About these problems you are about to hear. Since we're addressing the problems with an FDIC proposal, you may wonder why the FDIC is not represented on the panel. The answer is that they were invited, but declined to participate in today's discussions. Well, it seems to me that the SPOE is a variation on some older ideas which reflect too big to fail proposals going all the way back to the notable announcement of the too big to fail theory by then controller of the currency, Todd Conover, in 1984. For example, there are long-standing proposals that banks be required to issue certain amounts of subordinated debt to enforce at-risk debt. This one was actually tried with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and didn't work. Now, SPOE could also be viewed as a variation on COCOs, or contingently convertible debt, which has been much discussed. Will COCOs work? We don't know. My view is probably not. And of course, their very old holding company as source of strength, so-called by the Federal Reserve, this doctrine which fundamentally wishes to deny the corporate separation of bank holding companies from their subsidiary banks. If we look at it, SPOE would operate to protect the creditors of banks by transferring the losses that they might suffer to somebody else instead, as will be discussed by Peter and Paul. This looks like a different form of bailing out bank creditors, and thus just a new form of too big to fail. I have to say that my own sense in general is that all mechanistic programs for avoiding crises are doomed to be bypassed by events in time. Think of the much admired so-called prompt corrective action theory, which got put into statute in the FDIC Improvement Act of 1991. Sounded plausible at the time, but then utterly failed less than 2 decades later. Peter Wallison and Paul Kupiec are going to present their paper. They'll speak for about 20 minutes each. Then we'll hear from our distinguished discussants, whom I will introduce at that time. They'll talk for about 10 minutes each. I will give Peter and Paul a chance to respond to their comments and for some discussion among the panel, and then we'll open the floor to your questions, and we will adjourn promptly at 5 o'clock and proceed to our wine and cheese reception next door. Peter Wallison, who will speak first, holds the Arthur F. Burns Chair in Financial Policy Studies at AEI, where he co-directs the program on financial policy studies and writes provocatively, as you know, on a wide range of financial issues. Peter was a member of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission and provided an analytically detailed, controversial, and correct dissent from that commission's report. Previously, Peter was White House counsel to President Reagan, general counsel of the U.S. Treasury, and practiced banking, corporate, and financial law at Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher. Paul Kupiec is a resident scholar at AEI, focusing on the management and regulation of banks and financial markets, including systemic risk and the economic impact of our ever-multiplying financial regulations. Previously, Paul was director of the Center for Financial Research at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, served as chairman of the research task force of the Basel Committee, and held positions at the International Monetary Fund, J.P. Morgan, and the Federal Reserve Board. Peter, you have the floor.
This working? Yes. Thanks very much, Alex. Appreciate the introduction, as does Paul, if I may speak for him. Thank you all for coming today. This is, I think, going to be a very interesting conference, and we are sincerely looking forward to the comments of the discussants and commentators, because we believe there's a lot for us still to learn about this subject. Exactly a year ago, after consulting widely with the public and private stakeholders and experts of various kinds in bank regulation, the FDIC published a proposal for carrying out an orderly resolution of a systemically important bank without the financial markets being disrupted in any way, and this was called the Single Point of Entry, or we call it the SPOE strategy. According to the FDIC's public release, and I'm quoting now, the SPOE strategy is intended to minimize market disruption by isolating failure and associated losses in a SIFI to the top-tier holding company, while maintaining operations at the subsidiary level. In other words, the idea underlying the SPOE strategy is to use the assets of the parent holding company to recapitalize a failing subsidiary, or principally a bank, so that it can be kept operating. That will supposedly prevent a disruption of the financial markets, as occurred, for example, in the Lehman Brothers case, and such disruptive foreign actions as ring-fencing a bank's assets abroad. Judging from the praise that the FDIC received in the commentary on the SPOE proposal, many sophisticated observers thought that the FDIC had developed a solution to the problems of banks that were too big to fail. That is, so large that their failure would cause disruption or instability in the financial system. If the FDIC had in fact achieved this, it would be a big success, not only for the agency but also for the Dodd-Frank Act. And it would be a big help for the nation's largest banks, which were fighting the idea in Congress that the FDIC, and at the FDIC itself, that they should be broken up because they were too big to fail. Unfortunately, this praise may be premature. Our analysis suggests that there are serious holes in the SPOE strategy's legal foundations and in how it is supposed to be implemented. As a result, if we are really concerned that the failure of a large bank will trigger a wider financial crisis, Dodd-Frank has to be reopened, in our view, with changes made to the powers of the FDIC or the bankruptcy system to address this possibility. We do not have it now. Although the FDIC has not limited the SPOE strategy to banks, most observers have assumed that the FDIC's plan referred to the common structure of banking in the United States, that is, a holding company with a subsidiary bank and other subsidiaries. Our paper assumes that this is the structure that the FDIC had in mind. But it also makes sense to consider this case, and this case principally, because if the SPOE strategy doesn't succeed in managing the failure of a large bank, then it does not end too big to fail, and it does not accomplish the central purpose of the Dodd-Frank Act itself, which was to prevent a disorderly failure of a major financial institution without a taxpayer bailout. As outlined by the FDIC, the SPOE strategy would be applied when the Secretary of the Treasury is confronted by the possibility that a large bank is likely to fail. And that's the basic structure. That's what it looks like to the Secretary just before the SPOE strategy would be implemented. In order to avoid the consequences of that failure, the Secretary, as authorized by Title II of Dodd-Frank, will seize the bank holding company, that is the top holding company, and appoint the FDIC as the holding company's receiver. Nothing works. There's another slide. I only have 3, so disaster is not impending here. Yeah, right. Brian, you might have to sit there.
I think you should just keep rolling.
Yeah, well, I should. Okay. And anyway, there's another slide that shows what happens immediately after the Secretary takes hold of the holding company. The FDIC then immediately charters a bridge financial company and transfers to the bridge all the holding company's assets and secured liabilities, including the company's equity position in its subsidiaries, including the bank, of course. The bridge then functions as a new bank holding company, and the FDIC appoints the new management. All the old holding company's outstanding secured debt is left behind in the receivership. This leaves the new holding company free of unsecured debt and the owner of a failing bank that requires recapitalization. Finally, if the new holding company has sufficient assets to attract new credit, it's an important point, but if it does, it borrows the necessary funds and downstreams them as equity to the failing bank. This recapitalizes, is it now working? I can't even see it from here. Yeah, okay. So what happens is the funds are downstream to the failing bank as equity. That recapitalizes the failing bank, and the new holding company and the bank then continue to operate their business as they had done before. You can see, just as an aside, that the FDIC is now in charge of a receivership that contains the unsecured debt and the old shares of the holding company. The new bank then is completely recapitalized by this structure. This is what it looks like at the end. It's very neat because the bank has been recapitalized and it has never failed. The shareholders and the unsecured creditors and the old holding of the old holding company have suffered all the losses, and the main purpose of the SPOE strategy has been achieved. That is, the bank has continued operating and there has been no serious market disruption. This tidy solution is probably what persuaded many observers that the FDIC had made a real advance here in addressing the problem of how to prevent a disruption of the market by a big bank failure. However, there are some serious problems with this solution as we see them. First, where in Title II of the Dodd-Frank Act is the authority to recapitalize a failing bank with the assets of the bank's holding company? Title II seems to have been conceived by Congress as a liquidation mechanism for a large financial institution. The name of Title II, after all, is Orderly Liquidation Authority, not Orderly Resolution Authority. The Orderly Liquidation Authority was seen as an alternative to bankruptcy, which, in light of what happened after Lehman, was considered to be inherently disorderly. There are ideas about using existing or improved bankruptcy laws to deal with failing banks, but our paper does not cover these. While Title II clearly contemplates that a top-tier holding company can be seized by the Secretary of the Treasury and turned over to the FDIC as a receiver, it says nothing about using the assets of the top-tier company to protect the creditors of the subsidiary bank from suffering losses. And when you think about it, to do that, to take the assets of one group and turn them over to, in effect, to use them to assist another group is quite a radical idea in corporate law. And if this is what Congress intended, it would have to be clearly outlined in the law. However, Title II, the Orderly Liquidation Authority, says nothing about such a step. Title II says in two places, in fact, that it does not apply to bank subsidiaries. The Dodd-Frank language gives the FDIC broad authority to liquidate a failing financial institution, but that's all. It does not contemplate, as far as we can tell, the recapitalization of subsidiaries, and especially bank subsidiaries. It appears that Congress had in mind that the FDIC would use the authority, its own authority under the Federal Deposit Insurance Act to resolve any failing bank subsidiary. So immediately, the SPOE strategy has run into a serious legal problem. But that's not the only problem. The next legal problem with the SPOE strategy is this: what is the source of the Secretary's authority to seize the holding company and appoint the FDIC as a receiver? According to the language of Title II, the Secretary can only seize a bank holding company or a financial firm that is in, quote, default or in danger of default. Thus, even assuming that the FDIC can overcome the legal challenge by the shareholders and creditors of the bank holding company, that is, that their property rights are being taken and can be taken for the purpose of recapitalizing a subsidiary bank, the Secretary will have to demonstrate that the holding company itself was in default or in danger of default. The FDIC may have assumed in drafting SPOE, at least as far as we can tell, that if the subsidiary bank is insolvent, the holding company is probably going to be in default or in danger of default. And as Paul's presentation will show in just a moment, this is not necessarily true. In fact, for the biggest banks and their holding companies, it is not true at all. All of them remain solvent even if they have to write off the entire investment in their largest subsidiary bank. So if the holding company is not in default or in danger of default, the SPOE strategy cannot be employed for the largest banks. Still, there are some holding companies that will at least be in danger of default, and Title II contains language intended to clarify what that actually means. Unfortunately, it's ambiguous, leaving a lot of questions in doubt. For example, Title II provides several definitions of in default or in danger of default. One is a case has been or is likely to be commenced against the financial institution with respect to the bankruptcy code. Or a financial company has incurred or is likely to incur losses that will deplete substantially all of its capital. Its assets are likely to be less than its obligations, or the financial company is or is likely to be unable to meet its obligations in the normal course of business. These sound somewhat precise, and I'm almost directly quoting from the statute, but the trouble is, they're ambiguous. First, what does it mean to likely to be unable to meet its obligations? Or let's take the case of depleting all or substantially all the capital. What is capital? Risk-based capital, regulatory capital, equity capital. Capital is defined in generally accepted accounting principles. The law simply doesn't say. Now, this may sound a little bit like quibbling, but how these ambiguities are resolved will determine whether the losses in the bank will be suffered by the creditors of the bank or the creditors of the holding company. So, as the bank begins to weaken, the ambiguity about whether the holding company can be seized or not will become quite salient. If it looks as though the holding company could become insolvent, if the bank fails, the holding company will not be able to attract any credit, of course, but the bank will look like a pretty good investment. On the other hand, if it looks as though the holding company will survive, that it's bulletproof against default, The bank won't be able to attract any credit because its creditors will be the losers, and the holding company's debt will look like a pretty good speculation. The ambiguity about which set of creditors will suffer the losses is likely to cause as much market disruption as the impending failure of the bank itself. And then there's one final legal issue. As Paul will discuss in detail, the FDIC long ago realized that if the SPOE strategy is to work, holding companies will need to have a lot of debt outstanding that can be left behind in the receivership in the SPOE operation. That increases the capitalization of the new bridge holding company that we can see up there, and thus increases the likelihood that it will be able to attract sufficient private credit that can be downstreamed as equity to recapitalize the failing bank. Even if the subsidiary bank is healthy, its holding company will be expected to raise new unsecured subordinated debt. These funds, this is according to the FDIC, these funds will be held at the parent level, or alternatively, the funds could be downstreamed immediately as a loan to the subsidiary bank, which might at that point still be healthy. And then if the bank gets into trouble at a later time, that loan can be converted into equity. It can be essentially forgiven. Recently, the same idea was advanced by the Financial Stability Board, as many of you know, a largely European group of central banks and bank regulators, of which the Treasury and the Fed are members, when the FSB suggested that all banks or holding company groups should have sufficient subordinated debt outstanding so that it can be converted into equity at the appropriate moment to recapitalize a failing bank in the group. This debt is given the name Total Loss Absorbing Capacity, or TLAC, and that's how we will refer to it. Under the TLAC proposal, the debt could be pre-positioned at a bank level, and the same thing could be required by the Fed as part of the living will idea, we think, so that if necessary, the debt can be used to recapitalize the subsidiary by converting it at the bank level. But there is a big legal problem with this idea, which also affects the SPOE strategy. If the debt is the direct debt of the bank and is converted by action of the bank's directors, it would probably be permissible. But if the debt has to be downstreamed by the holding company to recapitalize the bank, it could potentially be a violation of the director's fiduciary obligations to the holding company's shareholders. If the shareholders believe that it is not in the interest of the holding company, the directors of the holding company could be subject to liability. If by downstreaming the debt as equity to the bank and forgiving it at the same time, the holding company would be rendered insolvent. In that case, it would certainly create a major liability for the directors. It is also likely to be treated as a fraudulent conveyance under state laws and the Federal Bankruptcy Act. Finally, if downstreaming or forgiving the debt did not make the holding company insolvent or likely to be insolvent, as I mentioned earlier, the Secretary could not seize the holding company under Title II, and the SPOE strategy could not be employed at all. To summarize then, there are severe legal obstacles to the use of the SPOE strategy. First, using the assets of the holding company to recapitalize a subsidiary, especially a bank, isn't authorized by the language of Title II. Second, even if that problem in particular could be overcome, it seems clear, as Paul will show, that the holding companies of the largest banks could not be seized by the Secretary under Title II because the insolvency of their biggest bank subsidiary would not render the holding company in default or in danger of default. And it's really the biggest banks that we are concerned about here. So if it doesn't work for them, It just isn't a sensible or usable prospect. Third, even if the holding company might be in danger of default, the ambiguity about whether it could be seized or not will create market disruption, because different groups of creditors will be affected depending on whether the Secretary can or cannot seize the holding company. Fourth, even if the holding company has enough debt outstanding to be recapitalized in a TLAC-style transaction, the directors of the holding company may not want to do so, because that might subject them to lawsuits by the firm's shareholders, and to some extent, if the holding company becomes insolvent, lawsuits by the creditors too, as a fraudulent transaction. And I am just about to finish, and that is the conclusion. You know, you shouldn't start from 3 o'clock. You should start from when we started, don't you think? Oh, never mind. The conclusion then has to be that the only way a failing bank is still can still, through the FDIC's powers, be resolved is through the current FDIC authority, whether or not the Dodd-Frank was enacted. The Dodd-Frank Act has nothing to do with what can happen today. It just hasn't solved the problem. The FDIC, in turn, has been able to prevent market disruption in the past only by selling a healthy bank, selling a sick bank to a healthy one. At this point, however, we recognize the deficiency of that policy. Today, we cannot imagine, as a matter of policy, selling Citibank, for example, to J.P. Morgan Chase, although some people in this room might imagine that's good. And no one can seriously argue that the FDIC, under current law, would be able to take over Citibank, break it up, and sell it off in pieces without creating a great deal of market disruption. In the end, then, the SPOE strategy does not solve the TBTF problem or accomplish the central idea of Dodd-Frank, which is to allow large banks to be resolved without taxpayer funds or severe market disruption. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter. Paul?
Brian, can you get my slides up? Thanks. It's almost like Peter's, why do I need to even speak? I'm convinced already, right? So thanks, Peter. So anyway, first, I'm going to try to look at some numbers. So we did the legal thing. Now we're going to look at some numbers. So could the SPOE be used if one of the largest banks fails? Now, the first little chart I have up there is, what you have to realize is that the largest banks are all subsidiaries of large bank holding companies. So here's a list of the 20 largest banks on the left and the holding companies which own them. So that's just kind of to fix ideas. And so what we're going to ask is, if among the largest of these banks, if they were to fail, could you use the SPOE to keep that bank from causing, to recapitalize that bank and keep it from disorderly causing financial crisis in the markets? And so to invoke the SPOE and the Orderly Liquidation Authority, the holding company must be in danger of default. So we're going to do the following thought experiment. Next slide, please. So I'm going to look at the top 15 holding companies now by size, and all of them have one of those very large banks. Each one of these has one of the largest banks from the last page. And I'm going to say, what if the largest bank in these holding companies had a loss that wiped out the equity of the bank, of the largest bank? What would be the position of the bank holding company after that? And if you were to do that in the last column there's only one of the top 15 holding companies that would actually have negative capital, and that's TD Bank. And if you hit the thing 2 more times, you'll see if the Secretary of Treasury wanted to be aggressive in his interpretation, then maybe U.S. Bank Corp. Or maybe State Street Bank would have a thin sliver of positive equity, so they could say they've mostly exhausted their equity and they're in danger of default. So those firms, TD Bank owns the 10th largest bank, U.S. Bank owns the 5th largest bank, and State Street owns the 8th largest bank. So among the very largest banks, if one of those subsidiaries would fail and lose the equity in the holding company, and the losses were just that equity, and the Fed could not use source of strength and impose any other loss on them, other than they could cut the bank loose. It could go to FDIC resolution. The bank holding company could go on, and of course it wouldn't be pleasant for the holding company, but they wouldn't be in default or danger of default. So in order to use OLA or SPOE on the largest banks, these holding companies are going to have massive losses in several subsidiaries in order to make the holding companies satisfy the OLA criteria. So we're going to switch gears a little bit here, and we're going to then focus on a set of systemically important banks that are special in the sense that they're bigger than $50 billion, so they're in that group of banks that they're systemically important. But these bank holding companies, while large, are going to own a single bank subsidiary. And among these bank holding companies, one of them stands out as Goldman Sachs, which is a very large firm. You all know Goldman Sachs. The bank is relatively small, so the bank's assets as a share of Goldman Sachs are pretty small, 11.44% according to that table. Whereas all the other holding companies here are mostly a single bank subsidiary. So these are very large bank holding companies that have a single bank as a subsidiary, and for all but one of these, the bank is virtually all the holding companies. So if there were to be trouble in one of these holding companies, and it would be in danger of failing and causing systemic risk, it would be because the single bank were failing. Not the holding company could go bankrupt and nobody would care. The holding company doesn't do anything. It's a shell that owns the bank primarily. So it's the bank that's in danger of default. So here's a case where SPOE could work if we got rid of all the legal issues, if the attorneys rewrote Title II and said you could use SPOE on a bank. This is a possibility. So here, the first thing that happens is that the equity is the loss absorbing capacity at either the bank or the bank holding company. And if we go to the next slide, what we can see here, and hit it again, is that leaving out Goldman Sachs again, in these banks and bank holding companies, the equity in the bank subsidiary is about equal to the equity in the bank holding company. So if a loss wipes out the equity in the bank subsidiary, the holding company is basically bankrupt. Right? So if the big subsidiary bank takes a loss that wipes out its equity, the holding company's underwater, the secretary's on good grounds to seize the bank and use SPOE. So then let's look what happens. So the equity's wiped out. Once the equity is exhausted, who's next in line to bear losses or recapitalize the bank? Well, it's the note or bond holders, the debt holders that aren't secured. And so for these debt holders, what we're going to now look at is we're going to ask, well, here, if the big bank is failing, there's kind of two things. The Secretary of Treasury could invoke SPOE, or it could let the bank fail, and it could let the bank go into an FDIC receivership, and if the holding company is bankrupt, it could go to bankruptcy, and the holding company, as we mentioned, its bankruptcy is not going to cause any trouble. It's really the bank failure. So there's two choices the Secretary's faced with here, is taking the bank through an FDIC resolution and letting the courts sort out the rest of it, or taking over the holding company with SPOE and saving the bank and recapitalizing it. So let's take a look here. What becomes important is where the liabilities are in these structures. And nope, you went too far back. So if you look at these banks, most of the banks and bank holding companies, most of the liabilities are actually issued out of the bank. So if you think about the size of the cushion that can bear losses after equity is exhausted, it's about equal. Equity is about equal between the bank and the bank holding company. So once that's gone, it's gone. The next thing is the debt. There's much, much more debt at the bank level that's been issued that could absorb losses than there is at the holding company. So if he's going to use SPOE, if the Secretary decides to use SPOE, the amount of debt available to cover losses and recapitalize the bank is much, much smaller than if the bank went through FDIC resolution. There's a whole huge block of debt out there that could absorb losses before the deposit insurance fund took a hit. So the next thing to think about is sort of the total loss-bearing capacity of the different things. And one thing that happens in an FDIC resolution when a big bank is taken in is all the depositors are generally protected. It's not just the insured depositors. The bank is sold to another bank. All the depositors are made whole. So that's not a loss-bearing capacity. You basically got the equity in the bondholders, and that's what you have both places. And if the holding company has lent money to the subsidiaries, well, that's got to be taken out of the equation because the holding company it can't default on its debt to the subsidiaries or it causes problems in the subsidiaries. So we have to kind of measure loss-bearing capacity by taking these things sort of into account. And if we do, I think if we go to the next slide, one more, the total loss-bearing capacity in an FDIC resolution is far and away larger than the loss-comparing capacity. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means if losses accumulate, first it wipes out the equity, then it goes to the debt holders, and then it goes to a safety net. In the case of an FDIC resolution, it goes to the deposit insurance fund. There is a gigantic buffer in a bank resolution before the deposit insurance fund gets hit. If it goes through the SPOE, there's a much, much smaller cushion of debt at the holding company to be wiped out before it goes to the orderly liquidation fund, which would be the next in line to bear the losses. And if it goes to the orderly liquidation fund, then all the systemically important firms are going to get assessed to pay it back. So the orderly liquidation fund is kind of like the deposit insurance fund for SIFIs. But large firms are going to be assessed to pay it back. And so there's a safety net in both cases, except the size of the private capital at risk is much bigger in these institutions in a Federal Deposit Insurance Act resolution. If you switch to SPOE, we're going to protect all these creditors who would have borne losses in an FDIC resolution, and we're going to impose the losses at the holding company. So we're going to switch who bears the losses, and there's much smaller loss-bearing capacity at the holding company level. And so there's a big difference there. So now it's not that the regulators didn't realize this. The regulators actually have realized this, and this is why Peter mentioned they have the FSB and the total loss TLAC, total loss absorbing capacity rules out there. And these are all about making sure that the holding company has enough loss-bearing capacity so that this use of the OLF safety net is very remote. You want the holding company to have enough equity and debt so that it could bear the loss. And you could see for these firms, the holding company would have to have a whole lot more debt, and the banks potentially a lot less debt in order to make this thing work and to feel comfortable that the OLF, the safety net, was not going to be invoked. So the FSB has put out the total loss absorption capacity proposal early November, and this is on the order of 20 to 25% for bank holding companies, 20 to 25% of risk-weighted assets. And the idea is the TLAC may be pre-positioned throughout the structure so that subsidiaries may have TLAC. So in the TLAC proposal, the bank holding company could have a 25% TLAC, a systemically important bank subsidiary could have a 25% TLAC, and the whole thing would consolidate up in some way so that these things all sort of footed out, and you'd have the right amount. Now, the whole idea, one of the ideas that gets at our legal issue about you can't use the SPOE to recapitalize a failing bank. It's illegal. Title II didn't envision it. Title II doesn't permit it. Well, one of the ways around this is to put TLAC throughout the subsidiary, and in particular, put TLAC requirement at the bank level so that the holding company could issue debt to the markets, TLAC debt to the market. It could take the proceeds and use that money to let the bank subsidiary issue debt in exchange for the money at the bank level. And the TLAC at the bank then essentially would be owned by the holding company. And if the bank were ever to get in trouble, this is the idea that the holding company could voluntarily say to that bank, oh, don't bother, we don't need that money back. You can keep that $5 billion. It's really okay with us. And the bank would then say, okay, well, we're not underwater anymore, and we go on our merry way. And as Peter has pointed out, the shareholders of the holding company may not be too happy with that, right? They may not be too happy giving a $5 billion present to the failing bank when they could have just legally cut the bank loose, sent it to the FDIC resolution framework and say, go do your thing, FDIC, and the bondholders, well, that's too bad. That's what you bought into. But these TLAC proposals then get around this legal constraint by essentially trying to place the debt at the bank level and then say, well, the holding company could forgive it. And then if the holding company were in danger of default because they don't have debt anymore, well, then the Secretary of Treasury could take them over, and then the SPOE could be invoked. And that would be a great world, wouldn't it? Because, they recapitalized the bank, weren't they nice people? And the Secretary can take it over and use the rest of the resources to bolster other subs. We're just doubting that the courts and the shareholder rights are going to work exactly that way. We think there might be some issues there. So, but it's a clever way around the legal restrictions. So to summarize, I think if we go a few more, the OLA and the SPOE do not end too big to fail. First of all, for the very largest banks, the bank has to be in default or danger of default. And unless the bank has distress at many of its large subsidiaries, it could lose its largest bank and still go on its way. It could cut its loose legally unless there's some other legal requirement that it's forced to recapitalize the bank through some source of strength doctrine, and those are things we can all argue about whether the law really permits that or not. Our reading of the law is that the Congress didn't say that. People may have other opinions, but it doesn't look to us that way. The other way is if you use this TLAC, or the other thing is if in the banks where it might be legal, where you might be able to use SPOE, there's not enough debt at the holding company level to cover losses. TLAC might solve that problem. TLAC could conceivably get around this legal problem of using the SPOE to recapitalize the bank by voluntarily, if the holding company would voluntarily recapitalize a failing bank subsidiary. But really, that's the legal problems raise issue here. And really what they ought to do is just have the bank issue mandatory convertible debt, which is out of the hands of the management of the holding company. Thereby they can't be sued. But then we're in a COCO's world. And what we're really talking about is a new contingent capital requirement to recapitalize banks. This would be issued out of the bank level, and it's really got nothing to do with operationalizing SPOE. It's just a new capital requirement at the bank level. You convert the debt. If the debt were issued out of the bank and not owned by the holding company, then if the debt were to convert into equity, it'd have no effect on the holding company at all. It wouldn't generate losses for the holding company. And so it's really got nothing to do with SPOE. It's just another capital requirement. So just to summarize, we think there's a strong legal case that Dodd-Frank really doesn't permit OLA or SPOE for banks. There's a lot of places in the law where it says that it's not supposed to be used for that. SPOE shifts losses from the bank to the bank holding company creditors. Because of that, it really reinforces too big to fail at the bank. If we were to ensure that all the large firms would be subject to SPOE, then the banks would have free rein to issue debt, and investors wouldn't need to worry because it'd be essentially guaranteed. The SPOE, the OLA law would say, don't worry about it, we're going to make you whole. That doesn't fix the too big to fail problem. The criteria of the OLA are broad and very ambiguous, which is going to create funding risk in the next crisis. You're not going to know where you should put your money if you don't know where the losses are. And these TLACs, which has merit in solving some of these issues, but it really doesn't make SPOE work. It really is just a new capital requirement for COCOs at the bank level, it seems to us. So I'm going to wrap it up there, and I really look forward to our discussants' comments.
Thanks, Paul. I'm going to ask all speakers to come up and join me, please, at the dais. While they're doing that, I'd like to just emphasize a point that's been made, which is the wonderful irony of pursuing the bureaucratic logic of this SPOE proposal, which is that in order to make it work, you have to make the holding company financially fragile. You have to, at least in some of these renditions, you have to force the holding company to have more debt and higher leverage and less sound finances so that you can close the holding company down if need be and transfer the losses to its bondholders. Well, a proposal which wants to force higher leverage and more financial fragility in an important set of companies is, as I say, to say the least, ironic. All right, we're going to move to our panel, and our first discussant will be Greg Baer, who is Managing Director and Head of Regulatory Policy at J.P. Morgan Chase. Previously, Greg was General Counsel for Corporate and Regulatory Law at J.P. Morgan, Deputy General Counsel at Bank of America, a partner at Wilmer Cutler, Assistant Secretary for Financial Institutions at the U.S. Treasury, and Senior Counsel at the Federal Reserve Board. He's the author of two books, The Great Mutual Fund Trap and Life, the Odds, and How to Improve Them. Greg, I think in finance, too, it's all about trying to improve the odds. No absolutes are available. Next will be Randy Gwynn, who is head of Davis Polk and Wardwell's Financial Institutions Group. In 2014, Randy was named Banking Lawyer of the Year by Who's Who of Banking Lawyers, and he was named one of the 10 most innovative lawyers in the United States by the Financial Times in 2013. So my question, Randy, is what's in store for 2015, and how are you going to top that? Randy's practice includes strategic bank regulatory advice, mergers and acquisitions, capital markets transactions, bank failures and recapitalizations, and maybe soon bank holding company SPOE transactions, and corporate governance. Our third discussant, David Skeel, is the S. Samuel Arsh Professor of Corporate Law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. He is the author of the books, The New Financial Deal, Understanding the Dodd-Frank Act and Its Unintended Consequences, Icarus in the Boardroom, The Fundamental Flaws in Corporate America and Where They Came From, and Debt's Dominion, A History of Bankruptcy Law in America, as well as numerous articles on bankruptcy, corporate law, and financial regulation. It's a great pleasure to have such an expert panel with us today, and we look forward to your comments. Greg, we can begin.
Thanks, Alex. Well, you've heard from Peter and Paul, and I'll be now quite merry about single point of entry. Sorry. The younger folks won't get that, but thankfully there are no young folks following this issue. About single point of entry. Before I do that, I just want to express my extreme gratitude and admiration to these guys for inviting us in to critique their work. It's a rare commodity these days to have folks willing to put themselves out there like that and actually hear principled opposition to their thoughts. I wish it happened more, and this is a sad rarity, so thank you. I think, Peter at the outset gave you a good sort of capsule summary and essence of single point of entry, although I'd have one addition. I mean, the goal is, as Peter noted, to avoid a Lehman-like series of global bankruptcies, and instead to have only one entity, the top-tier holding company in the United States, enter bankruptcy or a Title II resolution, which means that all the subsidiaries stay open and operating, which minimizes systemic risk, which is a good thing. The other thing it does, though, which I think is important and I'll get to in more detail, is that it identifies the holding company creditors, equity and debt holders, as a discrete, readily transparent, identifiable group of captive debt holders and equity holders who were in the first and second loss position in the event that the company fails, and for which they can price accordingly. And I'll get to why that's so important. The only other thing I'd want to note just at the outset is that while it can seem somewhat hypothetical here in an academic or quasi-academic setting, single point of entry is a reality. The Fed and the FDIC have made very clear that this is the resolution strategy they're going to use. The Fed will have out in the first quarter of next year the total loss absorbing capacity requirement that Paul alluded to, which will make major changes potentially to bank balance sheets. Europe is already well on its way to adopting single point of entry, and if you go to European capitals, they are quite conversant in single point of entry. The Bank of England is clearly following suit for the United Kingdom. France and Germany are following suit. So this is not terribly hypothetical. It's also not hypothetical, and I say this as someone at a bank, with investors and analysts and rating agencies who are quite conversant in single point of entry and following every development here. So this is a reality, not a hypothetical. And I also note, and I think Randy may talk about this more, single point of entry is not a creation of Dodd-Frank. It's a methodology, and it's just as compatible with Title I bankruptcy, which you don't need Title I for bankruptcy, with bankruptcy as it is with Title II, orderly liquidation authority. So let me get on to sort of one major point, and then I'll maybe have a lightning round and talk about some other quibbles with the paper. I mean, I think my most fundamental objection to the paper is the suggestion that somehow single point of entry is reducing market discipline, expanding the safety net, or somehow enhancing too big to fail. I think it's exactly the opposite, and profoundly the opposite. As I noted, you now have at the holdco level long-term creditors, equity and debt holders, who are clearly at risk and know they're at risk and price it that they're at risk. Under the expected TLAC requirement, which is already now out from the Financial Stability Board with the Fed to follow suit in the United States, but the FSB proposal at least envisions 16 to 20% total loss absorbency plus another 2.5 to 5% of buffers that don't count towards that requirement, so a conservation buffer and a GSIB surcharge. I think analysts, and again, there are analyst notes out on this already, estimate that for each of the U.S. GSIBs, that's probably going to equate to $300 to $400 billion of loss absorbency at the holding company level. So if you think about market discipline and ensuring that taxpayers are not at risk, that's $300 to $400 billion of assurance. I think on some level it's pretty obvious how much loss absorbency that is. It's certainly historically unprecedented, certainly for any diversified firm that's failed, and probably even for undiversified firms. I think you'll see a lot more detail about that through the comment period on the FSB proposal. And then I think it's also useful to think about it in a stress sense. I think it's always good to remind folks, you hear a lot about the Fed's CCAR process, but I think it's important to internalize some of the details about that. If you think about what CCAR represents as a stress, at least the parameters for this year, which are all public, it envisions an equity drop of 50%, so Dow from 18,000 to 9,000 over 9 quarters, unemployment going up 4 percentage points and peaking at 11.25%, so roughly a 75% increase in unemployment, the highest in 70 years. GDP down 4.75%, housing prices dropping 25%. So that's the severely adverse assumption. We don't know, obviously, any of the results for this year, but if you think about last year, where the parameters weren't terribly different, you saw all of the largest U.S. holding companies surviving that severely adverse stress as a projection and holding over 5% Tier 1 common equity after that. So that's how much loss absorbency is already there. Now, if you think about how much loss absorbency is there if you assume you need to not only wipe out the 5% or so to get you down to 5%, wipe out that additional 5% of capital, and then wipe out 10 to 15% loss absorbency in the form of debt that can be converted to equity, you're talking about, roughly somewhere on the order of 4 times the losses under a CCAR severely adverse assumption, which is a whole lot of loss absorbency. It also is, of course, a whole lot of market discipline on those creditors who are at risk in that sense. Now, of course, markets are smart. I think I can safely say that at AEI. And so the question is, what do they think of all this? And markets have already priced.
You can safely say anything at AEI, as long as it's polite and gentlemanly.
Thanks, Alex. I appreciate that. So I think markets have priced in this reality. It didn't get a lot of attention because it may not have been what people wanted to hear, but the GAO completed an one-year study this summer looking at the question of whether large banks receive a subsidy in their long-term funding as compared to regional banks. I think of 26 methodologies they looked at for measuring that, 18 concluded that large banks are actually paying a premium over regional banks in terms of their funding costs. The rest found either a negligible or no difference. And of course, that result, I think, reflected what treasurers and traders have long been seeing, which is that there really is not a funding advantage for large banks. The rating agencies, perhaps following the market rather than leading it, have adjusted accordingly. Moody's no longer gives an uplift for long-term debt. I think S&P is expected to follow suit once the Fed's TLAC proposal is out. So it's pretty hard to find market evidence that there's a funding advantage here. Of course, even when the rating agencies had a floor, I think the evidence showed, and there's a good paper out, that in fact the market was pricing at the non-support level, not what the rating agencies were suggesting. Now there is, I think, a very interesting trade-off here, which I think Paul in particular got to, which is worth discussing, and that is that truly under single point of entry, there is a shift in who's left holding the bag, in the sense that long-term debt holders and equity holders at the holding company levels are clearly first loss position, and subsidiary level creditors are in a better position. It's interesting that at the same time, with some notice, the rating agencies downgraded holdco debt, they upgraded subsidiary level debt, again reflecting the change in waterfall. I think there's a very good reason why policymakers wanted to do that, which is that you want to have first loss for systemic risk purposes with a group of people who cannot run. That is the long-term debt holders rather than those who can, the short-term debt holders. Now you can debate that. I think some have debated that. But I think what you can't debate is that in choosing between those two sets of private sector creditors, you are not in any way enhancing too big to fail. You're not putting taxpayers at any greater risk. You're choosing between two private sector groups, not increasing too big to fail or market perceptions of government support. So let me now proceed to the lightning round. just a couple of other thoughts. I understand the sort of semantic problem with doing a recapitalization under a provision called orderly liquidation authority, but I think if you read the statute in context, and this is clearly how the Fed and the FDIC have read it, that it does not require a liquidation either by asset or line of business. I don't know how you would actually define that. I think if you look at the context of the statute, the FDIC is asked to consider a whole variety of factors that are compatible with a broader authority to determine how to resolve large banks. As I noted, I think the paper occasionally equates Title II and single point of entry. As noted, I think it's just as compatible with Title I and is not really a product of Dodd-Frank. There is, and this gets to some of what Paul was talking about, I think a concern that the failure of the largest bank would not put the largest holding companies into insolvency and trigger Title II. I mean, I think to some extent that's a high-quality problem, although I don't really think that's going to be the case. I think it'd be unlikely that you would have a failure of the bank without significant disruption in the non-bank assets, namely the large broker-dealers. But more importantly, I think under source of strength, and we could have a whole conference on this, I think it's quite right that there was a time, and I've actually written about this recently, where source of strength was in somewhat, of legal question, going all the way back to M Corp, which was nice to read about in the paper. But I think since Dodd-Frank codified source of strength, I think it's difficult to contend that the Fed would not order the holding company to absorb the losses of the bank, and that those losses would not be transmitted up the chain. And then lastly, and although it wasn't a subject now, but it was in the paper, I think when you think about repayment from the orderly liquidation fund, even if you assume that all the capital and all the other loss absorbency is wiped out and that the orderly liquidation fund is drawn on, I think the chances of even the industry through assessment, much less the taxpayers, paying out on the orderly liquidation fund is very small, because when you look at the recoverability of the assets of the institution, where the fund will have first claim on realization of those assets, that the idea that there will be a loss to the fund and thus to the industry is a pretty low probability event. So let me stop there. Turn it over.
Good, thank you. Randy?
Okay. I'd like to just stress one thing that Greg said, which is to separate SPOE from Title II. They're not synonymous. In fact, I think SPOE, sort of the genesis point, was actually came at a debate when you had people from the FDIC debating in favor of orderly liquidation authority in the liquidation sense, and people from Europe arguing in favor of bail-in. And there were people who said, why couldn't you do a bail-in inside a resolution? And that was sort of the beginning of the development of single point of entry. So my own personal goal is and always has been to find a viable solution to the too big to fail problem. And unlike Peter and Paul, but like almost everybody else who studied the issue, I believe that the SPOE recap strategy is the most promising free market solution. I'm going to stress free market to that problem. While I believe that Title II gives the FDIC ample authority to carry out its SPOE strategy, I really couldn't care less whether the legal vehicle for doing that was Title II, the Bankruptcy Code, a new Chapter 14, or some other law. Under our system of government, to the extent Title II has flaws, it can be corrected by amending the law to facilitate a viable strategy. Now, what's interesting about the attack that Peter and Paul level on SPOE is that they don't offer any alternative solution. If there's any lesson that we learned in 2008, it's that in the absence of a viable alternative to, on the one hand, traditional bankruptcy and bank resolution strategies, and on the other, taxpayer-funded bailouts, the taxpayer-funded bailouts will be inevitable during financial panics. The alternative to bailouts in such times of financial stress is widespread contagion and even a collapse of the financial system. So the net effect of doing nothing different from what we had in 2008 is actually to institutionalize bailouts, to use Peter's words in a different context. Indeed, one of the biggest flaws of this paper, in my view, is that many of its arguments implicitly assume that the holding company creditors have a right to be insulated against losses by bailouts or other bank resolution strategies that are no longer viable, and that SPOE will deprive them of that right. Now, to be a viable solution to the too big to fail problem, any proposal needs to deal with a failing firm in a way that satisfies 4 mutually reinforcing conditions. First, it must maximize the value of the failed institution for the benefit of its creditors. Second, it must do so in a way that does not create or spread contagion or otherwise destabilize the financial system. Third, it must do so in a way that does not create or expand moral hazard. And fourth, it must do so without a taxpayer-funded bailout of shareholders or creditors. If properly implemented, the SPOE strategy will satisfy all 4 conditions. First, by keeping a holding company's subsidiaries open and operating, it maximizes the value of the banking group for the benefit of the holding company's creditors. The going concern value of a subsidiary is virtually always greater than its liquidation value. This is especially true in the case of banks during a financial crisis when assets can only be liquidated at fire sale prices. Obviously, SPOE does not achieve this goal as effectively as a bailout, but bailouts of creditors is the fundamental too big to fail problem that we're trying to solve. SPOE is a viable solution to the too big to fail problem in part because it minimizes the losses of a holding company's creditors compared to fire sale liquidations, not because it minimizes them compared to a bailout. Now, Peter and Paul actually use the Washington Mutual experience to argue that traditional bank resolution techniques, such as the quick sale of a bad bank like WAMU to a good bank like JPMC, will do a better job than SPOE in minimizing losses to holding company creditors. Now, it's interesting because I think during the oral presentation there was a sort of question raised about whether that technique can be used in the future, and that's the heart of my criticism of that argument, because the quick sale of a failing bad bank as large as WAMU is no longer a viable option the way it was in 2008, and there are several reasons for this. First and foremost, because of the successor liability that the DOJ and other agencies have imposed on good banks like JPMC and Bank of America, who purchased bad banks like WAMU and Countrywide in 2008. The FDIC is unlikely to find any willing bidders for bad banks like WAMU or Countrywide in the next financial crisis. Second, even if the FDIC could find willing bidders for bad banks the size of Countrywide or WAMU, it would not be able to find them for the much larger bank subsidiaries of the U.S. G-SIBs. Finally, it's not clear whether the banking regulators have the authority post-Dodd-Frank to approve such purchases in the light of the financial stability factor that was added by Dodd-Frank. Thus, the question is not whether SPOE would minimize the losses of holding company creditors relative to a quick sale like WAMU, but whether it would do so relative to the fire sale liquidation of an entire banking group during a financial crisis, and I think it's indisputable that it would be better than that. By ensuring that that BHCs have sufficient losses, and I'm getting to the second and third conditions, so by ensuring that BHCs bank holding companies have sufficient loss-absorbing resources in the form of equity and long-term unsecured debt. And let me stress that TLAC is not all debt. It's actually a combination of regulatory capital plus unsecured debt, and making it clear in advance that the claims of long-term unsecured creditors at the holding company level will be subordinate to the claims of short-term creditors at the operating subsidiary level. The SPOE strategy satisfies the second and third conditions that I outlined. The structurally subordinated debt at the top of the group acts like a shield against losses to the short-term creditors at the operating subsidiary level. This reduces their incentive to run when the group is failing, thus reducing the creation or spread of contagion or otherwise destabilizing the financial system when the holding company is put into a Title II or bankruptcy proceeding. At the same time, by announcing this priority scheme in advance, as Greg mentioned, it allows the market to price the holding company and operating subsidiary debt efficiently. The return on long-term unsecured debt at the holding company level will go up, and the return on short-term unsecured debt at the operating subsidiary level will go down. Far from being a subsidy or a form of bailout, this will force the short-term creditors at the operating subsidiary level to internalize the full cost of their priority advantage, thus eliminating any moral hazard that this priority advantage might otherwise create. Finally, SPOE accomplishes these goals without resorting to taxpayer-funded bailouts. all losses are imposed on shareholders and long-term unsecured creditors at the holding company level rather than taxpayers. To the extent the orderly liquidation fund or other lender of last resort facilities are used, they will or should be used solely to provide fully secured liquidity to recapitalize entities at above market rates. They should not be used to inject capital into BHCs or their operating subsidiaries. Capital injections are bailouts, but fully secured liquidity provided to recapitalize entities at above market rates is not. So in conclusion, it's my view that, that Peter and Paul's arguments against SPOE are not persuasive and rely on unreasonable or undesirable assumptions. Their approach will leave us exactly where we were in 2008 when the too big to fail problem reigned supreme. I don't think that bailouts occurred in 2008 because the bank regulators lacked a sufficient commitment to free market principles. I think they occurred because the bank regulators felt they had no choice in light of the bailout contagion dilemma. In contrast, I believe that the SPOE strategy is a viable solution to the too big to fail problem, and there are certainly details still to be worked out. But the reason I think it's a viable solution is that it maximizes the value of a failed banking institution relative to any of the available alternatives, reduces or eliminates contagion, does not create or expand moral hazard, and does all of this without resorting to taxpayer-funded bailouts.
Thanks, Randy. David?
Thanks, Alex, and thanks to Paul and Peter for inviting me to be on this panel. This is a very important paper, in my view, and a very important discussion. Because I'm going third, anything interesting that I would have said has probably been said already, but I'll just say it again, less interestingly, and say a few things from what I think is a slightly different perspective. So I see this paper as a devil's advocate kind of paper, that Paul and Peter are looking at SPOE and really running it through the ringer and conducting a stress test on it, essentially. And I think that's a really important exercise. And one reason I think it's a really important exercise is that even those of us, and I include myself in this group, who really don't like Title II very much, have tended to be impressed with single point of entry, and I remain impressed with single point of entry. I think it's a much more promising strategy than what Title II actually says. So to have Paul and Peter really conducting a stress test on it, I think is an important exercise, as I've just said. As I see their paper, what they're doing is they're really addressing what I see is somewhat different sets of issues in the paper. The first issue is whether single point of entry will work with the 6 or 8 largest American banks, 6 or 8 depending on which you count. The second issue is whether it will work with the next tier of banks, the banks that are below the biggest banks but are over $50 billion in assets and therefore are covered by Title I of Dodd-Frank. Paul and Peter answer no to both of those questions, but as I read their paper, they answer no for very different kinds of reasons. When they're talking about the largest banks, they answer no primarily because it's not clear to them that the largest banks will be in default or in danger of default at a time when their big bank subsidiary is crippled, when they first run into trouble. With the smaller banks, they make more of an argument that the prospect of single point of entry will make it impossible or very difficult for the smaller banks to borrow money on the bond markets when they get into trouble. And so single point of entry is problematic for that reason. Two very different kinds of reasons, and I'm going to focus on each of those two things, but I want to just really briefly touch lightning style, as Greg said, or whatever, however you said it quite elegantly, On a couple of other issues first. So just a couple straight points, and then I want to talk for a minute about what they have to say about the big banks, the biggest banks, and then a minute about what they have to say about the not quite so big banks. So 3 quick points. One is they talk a bit about the possibility of fraudulent conveyance in the paper, that if the holding company downstreams value to the subsidiary, the holding company may have committed a fraudulent conveyance. Very important to be clear here, and they are in the paper, so I just am really emphasizing something that they say, that it's not a fraudulent conveyance unless the holding company is insolvent or nearly insolvent. So if the transfer to the bridge corporation leaves the holding company fully solvent, any downstreaming of assets is not a fraudulent conveyance, even though the holding company is giving up value. Again, they say this in the paper, but I think it's a really, really important point. The second is, they make an argument about fiduciary duties of the directors of the holding company. There's an old point that Oliver Wendell Holmes made about a century ago about equal protection clause back then. He said it was the last resort of the constitutional lawyer, that when you run out of other arguments, you pull out the equal protection clause. I sort of feel like that about fiduciary duty arguments. Everybody thinks that fiduciary duty is the solution, and it's a real problem in these areas. It's not. And I think it's clear enough that source of strength is in Dodd-Frank. It's clear enough that everybody's expecting the directors of the parent corporation to downstream value at this point to the subsidiaries. I really don't think the fiduciary duty argument is a strong argument. The final thing I'll say by way of preliminary comments is I agree with Paul and Peter about what they say about liquidation in Title II, and this will make Randy crazy because Randy's heard me say this about 50 times. Probably a few people in this room remember Barbara Boxer standing up and saying, "Thou shalt liquidate. This is not a bailout bill. We are going to make sure that these big institutions are liquidated," and it says in Dodd-Frank, "Thou shalt liquidate" when you put them into Title II. There is a clever lawyerly argument that single point of entry is a liquidation. It's not a liquidation. For 150 years, we've done reorganization exactly the way single point of entry works. In the best of all possible worlds, Congress would just change the really dumb "thou shalt liquidate" rule in Dodd-Frank, but I can't resist always making that point. I think there's never going to be a court that this issue is going to get before that's going to refuse to allow single point of entry on these grounds, but it is inconsistent with Dodd-Frank. So a couple quick points about, first, the big institutions and then the not quite so big institutions. So the main argument about the big institutions is it doesn't look like they will be in default or in danger of default when a bank subsidiary fails. I don't find this argument persuasive at all. I find their arguments about the smaller banks a lot more persuasive than their arguments about the big banks. I think if Citigroup has a bank that's about to fail, as Greg said, its broker-dealer is going to be failing, everything's going to be failing. And that combined with the fact that the definition of default or danger of default, which includes things like, will your capital be too small, or is it likely to be too small? Is there a likelihood your assets will be less than the obligations you have that you've incurred? It's going to be really easy for bank regulators to show default or danger of default. And that's a 24-hour decision by the district court here in D.C. I just don't think that's a real argument. I don't think, I think that's an easy requirement to make, to meet, not a tough one to meet. And I also think when the U.S. Treasury says that Citigroup is in default or in danger of default, it is pretty much by definition in danger of default at that point. The comments that Paul and Peter make about the complexity of TLAC, they didn't emphasize this too much in their discussion. I think those are more serious issues. If you look at what's going on in Europe, The TLAC discussions are unbelievably complicated, and there is a real risk that the TLAC requirements are going to make things just a big muddle. I think that's a more serious concern. I mean, my hope is that here in the U.S., the Fed won't pay too much attention to what they're doing in Europe, because I think the TLAC can be done more easily in the U.S. because of the capital structure of our banks than in Europe. But there is a risk that this is going to be mind-numbingly complex. Just a word or two about the smaller banks before I close. Paul and Peter point out that that single point of entry will protect the creditors of the bank subsidiary, which will make it hard for the holding company to borrow on the bond market. I think this is a really nice point, and I think this is a concern. They also make the argument that there may be some uncertainty about whether the FDIC will actually intervene at the holding company level or whether they'll intervene at the sub level. I think that's also a nice point. I think that is a real concern. Another point that they don't make, that I hope they will make, is it's not clear that Title II should be used for these banks at all. One of the requirements for regulators to put a bank into, or other financial institution into Title II, is that they show the failure of the bank is likely to cause systemic harm. Now, a quirk of the way Title II is written, that's not a legally challengeable decision, but that is part of the decision-making process. You're not supposed to use Title II unless the bank failing is likely to cause systemic harm. What do I conclude from that? I conclude from that Title II shouldn't be about these smaller institutions. It should be about the 6 to 8 biggest institutions. And the folks on this panel won't be surprised this is where I'm ending up. I think we need to make sure the bankruptcy code will work for the other ones. And there's some legislation called Subchapter 5 that the House just passed by a voice vote that will come up in the early in the new year, that is designed to do a single point of entry kind of strategy in bankruptcy. I think we should all get behind that. I think there's some other things we could do to the bankruptcy code, but I think that would move things forward. And then we wouldn't have to worry about using single point of entry under Title II with those smaller banks. And the question would only be whether it will work for the 6 to 8 largest banks. And, you know, as a little sop to Greg and to Randy, I think it just might. I actually still do think it's a clever strategy.
Thank you, David. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have heard from 2 members of the prosecution, 2 members of the defense, and 1 very expert witness.
Muddled.
And I think they have given us an excellent setup of this discussion. We're going to give Peter and Paul a chance to reply to the comments, but before they do, I just want to say one thing, and that is the whole discussion around recognizing likely to fail and whether the regulators could do that is precisely the logic of the FDIC Improvement Act of 1991 and so-called prompt corrective action, which was a complete and utter failure in the 21st century. With that, Peter, comments.
Thank you, Alex. And where to start?
Wherever you want.
I'm going to start on the idea that this is really a stress test, because I think it's actually a public service, simply because the entire process can be brought to a halt with lawsuits. When I was in law school, the first thing I learned in law school, actually, if I learned anything in law school, it was in this sort of litigation case system that we had at Harvard Law School, was that if the law is against you, you argue the policy. And what we've heard here is that a lot of people are arguing the policy when the law is completely against them. And I want to explain what this means. Now, maybe today, living in the world we live in, it is possible that you don't have to enforce the immigration laws, for example. And so if you are at the FDIC or you're at the Fed or whatever it is, you don't have to worry about what the law actually says. But I'm not yet at that point, and I'm still preferring to argue the law. And the law says that Title II is a liquidation idea. It doesn't say anything about recapitalizing a bank. Now, maybe you can be imaginative and say, well, we're liquidating the holding company, we're using that to recapitalize the bank. But if you're a shareholder of the holding company or a director of the holding company, you have a completely different idea about this. And that is that you have certain rights that were not addressed by the Dodd-Frank Act or Title II. And there's nothing in Title II that gives the regulators or anyone else the authority to take your property and use it, as I said in my prepared statement, to assist the creditors of another entity, which happens to be your subsidiary. Let me talk just briefly about the source of strength doctrine, because that is very closely related. It's discussed in our paper. I didn't discuss it because we didn't really have time. But the source of strength doctrine has never been filled out. It's an idea that the Fed has used, and there have been many opportunities for Congress to actually fill it out. Now, Greg said that it was codified in the Dodd-Frank Act. Well, if you look at the Dodd-Frank Act, it says, yes, we agree with the source of strength act, the source of strength doctrine. That's the codification. What is the source of strength doctrine? It's simply a statement by the Fed that bank holding companies have to be a source of strength for their subsidiaries, not just financial strength, but management strength too. Does it mean that a bank holding company has to make itself insolvent in order to be that source of strength? Not necessarily. And the Fed has never said that. And the one time the case has really been brought up in the federal courts, in the M-Court case, the court said no. That was reversed on appeal to the Supreme Court on technical, unrelated grounds, and never further litigated. So it is not at all clear what the source of strength doctrine means, and that the reason it is the purpose of the source of strength doctrine is to put bank holding companies into a position where they can be made insolvent in order to increase or create the solvency of their own subsidiary banks. I'd like to mention a couple of other points. The suits by the shareholders and the creditors. I don't think this is a minor point. And the reason that I think Paul and I wanted to get this paper out is to prevent the government from going ahead with something that, when it is really needed, when we do have a financial crisis, the whole thing is brought to a halt by a series of shareholder or creditor lawsuits. Now, someone mentioned, I think it was Randy, or it might have been David, to the effect that, well, there's 1 day for the court to make this decision. Not true. There's 1 day for the court to make this decision after the secretary has taken over the holding company. But there's no restriction on injunctions before the secretary has moved. And that is, I think, where this whole thing will occur when we are moving toward the possibility that the secretary may take over a holding company and impose the SPOE. What happens is that the shareholders or the creditors or both then attempt to get an injunction against that action by the secretary on the ground that it's illegal. And as far as I can see, it is illegal. And so I would assume that unless we settle this question and make sure we know what the law is in this case, we are going to have a very messy situation when we really need it.
Thank you. Paul?
Yeah, I want to thank all three of you for the comments. They're wonderful, and the back and forth we've had has been very helpful for us. A couple of things. I mean, to Greg's point, we're not really picking on the biggest banks as being too big to fail. We're just saying that if you look at the incentives created by these alternative regimes, if you look, and you look at the capital structure right now, one regime would protect a whole lot more creditors than the other regime if they blew through the capital and the total loss-bearing capacity. Under TLAC, they may have so much loss-bearing capacity, that's a moot point. But if you were to push it, so we're not really going after, we're asking, does this new law and rule operationally make it fail-safe that you could take care of a failing large bank SIFI without causing financial distress using the SPOE system, the SPOE strategy under Title II. And I'll go back to the law at one point. I mean, Title II specifically says that the orderly liquidation authority does not apply to banks or to bank subsidiaries. I'm not making that up. It's right in the law. So it's a little bit bizarre that the FDIC can write this whole thing about SPOE and claim it's for banks when the law itself says you're not supposed to use Title II for banks. It's right there in the law. Moreover, it says you can't use the orderly liquidation fund to benefit the deposit insurance fund, which means you can't use the orderly liquidation fund to cover losses that would have hit the deposit insurance fund. It's right in the law. It says that. The other thing it doesn't do anywhere in Title II, because it was never intended to be used for banks, is it never says how the priorities mesh with the deposit insurance fund priorities. Now, if they really thought that you could use the authority in Title II to resolve a failing bank, they would have spoken to, under Title II, where depositors in banks, where their priority is in the payout schedule. But it's not mentioned anywhere. It doesn't interface with the Federal Deposit Insurance Act or the Depositor Preference Act. It's missing. It's missing because it wasn't supposed to be applied to banks. And so the whole act was never intended to be used for banks. It was intended for things like Lehman Brothers or Salomon Brothers or the holding companies and not for the banks. But the biggest problem is too big to fail banks. The biggest problem is when WAMU was failing, what did they do? They sold it to another bigger bank and created another too big to fail the bank. And the problem is that if you can't use SPOE because of legal arguments and it falls apart, or you can't use SPOE because the holding company isn't insolvent. Now, I agree with Greg, and I agree with all of these people. If the biggest bank in the largest bank is in trouble, it's probably the case that other things in the holding company are in trouble. But is it fail-safe that the bank holding company is in danger of default? I think the numbers are way too big if just the largest bank fails to assume it. Now, would the Treasury Secretary at the time and the FDIC chairman and the Federal Reserve say the bank was in danger of default and take it in? Yeah, I believe they would. And I believe it would violate the property rights of a lot of investors because it's going to take the losses from one group of investors and transfer them to another. And would the court stop it in 24 hours? Absolutely not. But would there be lawsuits later on? I think absolutely there would be lawsuits. And the question is, let's go back to WAMU. We're not saying WAMU is a case study of a good thing. WAMU is a case study of where the losses get transferred. Under the existing system, the holding company debtors got 100% recovery, and the bank debt holders are getting about 25% back. If it went through SPOE, it would be exactly reversed. The holding company debt holders would have lost everything, and they would need to go into the OLF for about $7.5 billion of money to make the thing work and give it to JP Chase. Now, the OLF can be used to recapitalize institutions. There is nothing in the law that says the funds with the OLF have to be fully secured. That's Randy's idea. Now, we agree with Randy, that's a great idea, but there's nothing that requires the FDIC to not use the OLF to recapitalize a failing institution. They can. The law says they can. And the law says if they do that, they have to assess other SIFIs if they can't recover it in a 5-year period. So the law fully gets it that the OLF can be used to fund, but it's got to be paid back, and it would be paid back. And yes, it's not paid back by general tax revenues, but it's paid back by other SIFI firms. And Greg, JP Morgan's a taxpayer, I assume? Okay, you'd be, yeah. All right, one of the nation's largest. So those are taxpayers too. Just like the Deposit Insurance Fund isn't taxpayer money, it's bank money, but they're taxpayers too. There's a safety net. So you mutualize the losses, that creates the moral hazard. The moral hazard is more of an argument just to see where the losses go in these things. The last thing I want to point out is that really.
And
the
you have
wa-
you have 1 minute to point it out in.
I'm going to give you 30 seconds. The WAMU thing is fully operational. If it were to fail today, Section 622 of the Dodd-Frank Act, which is the concentration rule that was just put out the Fed, has a big exemption that says you can't violate you can't buy another firm that breaks the concentration rule unless you're buying it to assist a failing bank. It's a big exemption. So it's written in the Dodd-Frank law that you could do that all over again. It's there. I didn't put it in there, but okay, stop.
Thank you.
One more.
One more.
Now I've forgotten what I wanted to say.
We'll come back. We'll come back
I'll come
because
back.
what I want to do, we're 10 minutes away from time for audience question and answers. We have still 5 speakers. I want to give, this is the true lightning round. We'll go in order, starting with Greg. Everybody gets 2 minutes to add anything you want at this point.
Sure. I won't debate with esteemed counsel Peter Wallison the meaning of liquidate, although I may have a different view. But I would make one point because I think it's relevant to that thought, which is, in a single point of entry, I mean, obviously the equity holders are going to be wiped out regardless, right? But I don't think you'll see debt holders with single point of entry saying, I want my liquidation and I want it now, as opposed to a single point of entry recapitalization, because while they are left behind, they do still have a claim. And it's hard to imagine a scenario where they will not recover more under a recap where the subsidiaries remain open and operating than they would under a liquidation. So even if one granted, and I think David was getting to this earlier, even if one granted Peter's interpretation of the law, it's pretty hard to see which creditors are going to be suing to demand a liquidation. For Paul, I agree that, I mean, I really hadn't thought as much about single point of entry in the context of an institution or a holding company that had almost all of its assets in the bank. I think its primary virtue has been to provide an elegant way of resolving companies that have a lot of assets in their broker-dealers and a lot of assets overseas. I've always assumed, and I can understand actually why some of the regional banks are sort of sore about TLAC, that if you have all or almost all of your assets in a bank, then there is another way of resolving it, which is the traditional FDIC resolution process, which no one thinks is too big to fail. Although if you wanted to find that the large banks are not too big to fail, but the smaller ones are, I would commend that. I think as long as there is a traditional way to resolve them, that's fine. I think of course, this is why they object to the TLAC proposal, I think, being imposed on them, which is they're deposit funded. They have a means of being reorganized that way. So why should they have to reconstruct themselves with more long-term debt at the holding company level to be resolvable under a single point of entry? But again, that is a subset of banks. For the largest GSIBs, maybe with one exception, you're really talking about using recap as a way to get around the fact that most of the assets are not in the bank and therefore can't just all enter an FDIC traditional resolution mechanism.
Thank you. Randy?
So I want to just stress that we really need to separate criticisms against Title II from criticisms against SPOE, because virtually every one of the points made by Peter and Paul were criticisms of Title II and not SPOE. And you know what? Title II is not artfully drafted. It was sort of marked up from the Section 11 of the FDIA, which was also not artfully drafted. And so it has a lot of ambiguities and hard to understand provisions. I think the problem for your argument, though, because of those ambiguities, is that there's something called the Chevron case that basically says any reasonable interpretation of ambiguous laws will do, and the courts won't overturn it. So I think to the extent there are ambiguities, that just means more discretion for the FDIC. That's not good. I'm not saying it's good. I would actually amend many provisions of Title II to actually constrain the FDIC and point them more directly down appropriate paths. But I don't think that those ambiguities actually mean that they don't have the authority to do SPOE under Title II. But it is interesting, what I'd really like to do is ask a question to Peter and Paul. I think the answer would be no, but I'm not sure I believe it exactly. But I'd like to say, if you could actually amend all of the infirmities in Title II to make SPOE work and have it be authorized, would you do so, or would you say, no, independently, I'm against SPOE, it's a bad idea, or is it that Title II is a bad idea?
We'll take that question up in due course. David?
Peter's about to jump out of his seat, but, and I don't have much more to add. I'll just double down on my bankruptcy point, and that is remind everybody that Dodd-Frank says Title II is only supposed to be used if bankruptcy would not work. The living wills in Dodd-Frank are premised on a bankruptcy, not on Title II. And so even though this paper is about single point of entry, I think bankruptcy needs to be part of the discussion, and that is part of the subtext, I think, of Randy's point, that SPOE isn't just about Title II.
Thank you. Peter, are you ready?
Haven't talked to my co-counsel though, but the point I wanted to make before is part of the same thing, and that has to do with the OLF, because one of the objectives of the whole SPOE idea is to prevent the the taxpayers from having any obligation. If, as I think, the entire notion of SPOE, as it is currently spoken of within Title II, is illegal, when the point comes where the OLF is used in order to recapitalize the bank, and then the FDIC turns to the other SIFIs and seeks to recover from them the costs that OLF lost in that process, the defense will be, this was an entirely illegal process. There's nothing, just exactly what I said. In fact, I'll write the brief, an amicus brief for them. This was not authorized, what was done with the recapitalization of the bank, and we're not going to pay. And I think they might win that suit, in which case the taxpayers will be the losers in that case. So it'll all come back again to whether this is a legal process or not. And I must say that we do live in a time now when the government seems to be able to do just about what it wants, and the courts do not intervene. Paul suggested that the government might be able to do this without it being stopped by the courts. I'm not so sure of that, but even if that is true, in the end, there will be someone is going to be asked to pay, and if the law was violated, and after the whole thing is done, those payments will have to be made, and I believe they will have to be made by the taxpayers, because what was done was not legal. One other point, and that is, would the SPOE be a bad idea if Title II were amended in order to make it legal? And there I have no objection. I think SPOE would be a perfectly good idea, because in that case, the shareholders of the holding companies would understand what they were doing. They were not buying the shares of a corporation. They were buying the shares of some other kind of entity that is actually liable for the losses of the bank. Just like years ago, before we had corporations, all of the shareholders of banks had to pay up if the bank suffered a loss. And if that's the deal, if people want to go back to that, that's fine with me. But I don't think the law right now says that.
Can I answer, Randy? Just SPOE in bankruptcy, if you can contract it and it works, I think we're great with that. As Peter said, if they amend the law and SPOE works for a Title II where the government safety nets are involved. In bankruptcy, no safety nets are involved, and if the contracts recognize all this, no problem. Even though when you go to amend the law that SPOE would be legally possible, there's the uncertainty about who's subject to it, and that means property rights are uncertain, and the Secretary of Treasury decides at the last minute whether Norbert suffers the loss or maybe Bert. I don't know who's the favorite. It depends on who's in power, and you're going to take the loss. Is that the way it always works? Not take the loss. So there's going to be this politics involved, and is it George Soros, or is it the Koch brothers who happen to own it? And all that makes a real problem. So it has to be, the property rights have to be certain. I mean, I think if the SPOE is going to apply, it's got to apply above a certain level, even settling the legal thing. So I think the uncertainty and the political choice involved at the end is a bad way to run a country, but I'll stop there.
Greg is dying for a little rejoinder. You got 1 minute, and then we're going to Q&A.
Sure. I mean, just 2 points on the orderly liquidation fund in response to Peter. I mean, first, the orderly liquidation fund cannot be used to recapitalize. It's a liquidity fund, and there are restrictions in the statute that it has to be for liquidity purposes and not for solvency purposes. Importantly, also, even before you turn to an industry assessment with the potential of some lawsuit, the liquidation fund, the Treasury, has a super priority on all the on all the assets of the failed institution, which will not be insubstantial. We actually did the math on this, and Peter and I can talk about it offline. But we walked through a sort of example of what this would mean, at least for our bank, a couple of years ago. And the assumed losses you would have to suffer over time on those assets are historically unprecedented. So even before you get to the possibility of an industry assessment where the industry might object on the legal grounds that Peter raised, you have to suffer historically unprecedented realization on the assets over the course of the resolution, which is highly unlikely.
Let's stop at this point and turn to your questions in the audience. May I remind you of our rules, which is please first wait for the microphone and then tell us who you are and what your affiliation is, and then state your question. If the question is prefaced by too long a statement, the chair will call you to order. We're going to start in the back here, and then we'll come up to the younger gentleman in the front.
J.W. Verrett,
JW.
on leave from George Mason Law School at House Financial Services right now. I just wanted to question a little bit and throw myself into the debate between Peter and David on whether or not fiduciary duties serves as a constraint on the ability of the BHC to hotline support down to the subs, whether secured or not, or inappropriately secured or whatever. There are two reasons why I think, at least at a minimum, I wonder if the paper could use a little bit more discussion about that question. Prior to 2008, I think I would have accepted it's more likely than not that there would be some exposure, but I think there are two reasons why I wonder now if that statement of black letter law is as clear. First, if you look at what happened to B of A and the decision whether or not to exercise the MAC clause.
JW, I'm just telling you have about a half a minute to get to your question.
Look at what happened with the MAC clause in Merrill. Terrible policy, the pressure from the Fed. But at least there's a good argument that the board could say, look, we get business judgment rule protection for going along with this because we had the threat of regulatory retribution. And then you look at what happened with Delaware and the Bear Stearns case. The Delaware Chancery Court didn't want anything to do with that shareholder challenge. So I wonder if maybe just a little bit more exploration of that would be useful for the paper. Seems like a complicated story. Maybe it's still too much uncertainty for a good policy, but maybe look at it further.
Can I just add real quickly to JW's point, take Citigroup as well, which is another big fiduciary duty suit coming out of the crisis.
I just wonder how many of the lawyers at this table would advise their clients that they are, as directors of a company, they are insulated from liability for doing something of this kind. I think it is far outside the normal range of things that are expected of companies that are real companies to take an action that makes the company insolvent. And you get no compensation for it. You are just taking it away from your creditors and giving it to someone else's creditors. Now, that someone else is a bank, granted, but it seems to me very unusual that something like that would be permitted by a court. I'm not familiar with these cases in particular, but it would mean, really, that a bank holding company is not a separate organization from its subsidiary bank, and that strikes me as unusual and strange.
Greg wants to reply, but I want to first have a vote of any, including all. Just hang on just a minute. I want to have this vote of all the lawyers in the room. Answering Peter's question, how many of you would advise your clients who are directors of the bank holding company that you're protected and just fine under the circumstances he defines? How many
Well, he didn't define the circumstances, though. That's the problem. I could define circumstances in which it would be perfectly appropriate, and that was the main point of one of my comments, is that I think Paul and Peter are assuming that the alternative to choosing a single point of entry is a nice, successful Washington Mutual value maximizing quick sale. And my point is, that's not even on the table anymore. The alternative to single point of entry is a fire sale liquidation. And there's going to be a huge delta between a fire sale liquidation and an SPOE. And so I think one could easily imagine circumstances, in fact, I think it's the more likely circumstances, that it's going to maximize the value of the enterprise for the benefit of the creditors to enter into a single point of entry rather than face a breakup and liquidation of the group.
Yeah, I mean, or put another way, if I'm a creditor of the holding company and my choice is for my directors to keep the holding company solvent and have a disorderly failure of its principal asset, or alternatively, to recapitalize its most valuable asset and ultimately receive a return on that, I don't think it's clear that I would take the first choice.
I don't think a return is, you don't get a return in that transaction. If you're a creditor of the holding company, you're taking one for the team, right?
No.
I mean, what is happening is.
No, you get equity in the bridge. I mean, while the debt holders are left behind in the sense that their debt, some or all of their debt claim is extinguished, they receive equity in the new holdco, and the new holdco's principal asset will, in all likelihood, be that bank.
Yes.
So they have a root and interest.
Well, they get some interest back, and that would be true in kind of any workout of any kind. You get some interest.
In a panic,
But-
highly uncertain value.
Yeah, highly uncertain, and you become a shareholder when you were a creditor, and so what your $1 million investment becomes something on the come from the holding company that's been created. It's a completely different situation. And
But if the alternative is to get
Hang on,
money-
panel.
Let-
Hang on, panel. We're going to give JW one more minute, and then we're going to proceed.
Just one quick point that I think the context of this decision is important, because I think the council would be advising, Greg can be advising the board, not only in the context of that specific decision, but also in the context of, and again, all indicia of bad policy, bad federal policy in the wake of Dodd-Frank, but in the context of probably the BHC is also a participant in some liquidity facility, and the federal regulators can threaten to cut you off from that. They have enormous subjective power in reviewing your CCAR and your living wills, and that threat is going to be on until the end of time, assuming you survive. So it's also in the context of all of those implicit threats, sufficient that you might get business judgment protection for what otherwise might be a bad decision. So.
Okay, I think we can all agree we would not like to be the directors being so advised. Bert.
Thank you. Bert Ely, banking consultant and not a lawyer. As I look at this law, it would seem to me that there might be an incentive, and this is my question, is there an incentive for the large bank holding companies to start splitting up their banks, so that instead of having one large bank in the holding company, that they might have 5 or 10. In other words, we have a reversal of the consolidation process we've had in holding companies. And the reason to do that would be to reduce the threat of loss to the creditors of the holding company, and thereby bring down their funding costs. So I'd be interested in your reaction as to how is this Title II particularly going to affect the organizational structure, the legal structure of bank holding companies. And if I could just tack on a minor technical question for the lawyers, does anybody foresee any constitutional challenges to any aspect of what we've been talking about today?
Okay, let's take the first question first. Anybody want to take that up? Paul?
Yeah, to the degree that you could take your banks and split them up into smaller certs and then each put them under separate holding companies, then you could have a situation where Title II could go in at a holding company well below the parent. It would be the parent of the failing bank, and you could shield the rest of the firm. I don't know operationally how challenging it would be to split the largest bank in JP up into 3 different small banks and put them under small holding companies. Plus, you have the living will thing where they're going to come back and say, oh, we don't like that complexity. And the FDIC's basically and the Fed are going to say, we don't want you to do that. We want all the TLAC. I think what they're saying is at the top holding company, that's where they want it, which to me, I think that really has problems. You could, but what I'm trying to say is if you had each of them owned by a sub-holding company, you could potentially shield the top holding company from being taken over, because the top holding company of the failing bank would be a subsidiary holding company. Dodd-Frank, Title II could go in at any holding company level. It can't take over a bank, but it can take over any non-bank financial firm, which could be any holding company anywhere in the structure, in theory. I don't think they want to do that.
Other comments on this one?
Yeah, I think as Paul said, there'll be a multiplicity of reasons why a large holdco wouldn't want to do that, unrelated to this topic. But, if you think about the TLAC requirement, that is the total loss absorbency requirement at the holding company level, I think one of the justifications for that is even if U.S. GSIBs already, and I think they do, have sufficient loss absorbers at the holding company, as we were discussing, with the new structure, single point of entry, you're better off as a subsidiary level creditor, clearly. So companies would have an incentive, or creditors would have an incentive, to move down to the op subs or the subsidiary holding companies. But one of the main purposes of the TLAC is to prevent that from happening. So I think Governor Tarullo referred to it in November, December in his speech as preventing erosion of top-tier holdco loss absorbency. So in effect, they're saying, look, you can't move the absorbency down to a level where you're less exposed.
Any comments on the constitutional question?
I think there's a standing problem with the constitutional question. That right now, no one, I think, would have standing to challenge it. But in the event that it looked as though the regulators were moving, the Secretary of the Treasury was moving toward taking over a holding company under the SPOE kind of proposal, I think at that point you would have standing, and someone will come in and attempt to stop that injunctively. Whether the courts will respond to it or whether the courts will shy away, I don't know, but there isn't any protection against that in the statute. There is, as I said before, after the Secretary has acted, the court has 1 day, but before the Secretary has acted, there is no restriction.
Can I just say a couple quick things on Bert's constitutional question? One is, once they have acted, it's a very lenient standard of review. It's an arbitrary and capricious standard. And the other thing I would say is Hoover Institution, which is behind some of the bankruptcy stuff, the Chapter 14 stuff, in the second book that we've done, it's called Bankruptcy, Not Bailout. Ken Scott has a chapter that talks a lot about the constitutional issues and the due process issues with Title II in particular. So it's worth looking at, I think.
Thanks, David. We have time for one more question, I'm afraid. Well, do you want to keep going? All right, we'll take 2 more questions. We'll get you back here.
Okay, I just have 2 quick questions. Norbert Michel, Heritage Foundation. Great discussion. Thank you, guys. One is for Greg, and the other is for David. Greg, if you effectively, I won't say explicitly guarantee, but if you effectively guarantee to the subsidiary that it has a giant capital infusion coming, could that possibly increase moral hazard? Because it seems to me that it would. And then, David, I may have misunderstood what you said, but based on the way that I understood what you discussed with bankruptcy and the 6 to 8 largest firms, why would you not want the new bankruptcy provision to, or new bankruptcy law to also apply to those guys?
It's interesting. I think the firms are managed on a consolidated basis. So, to the extent that there is a TLAC requirement, it's pushed down to subsidiaries as part of their own internal capital and return requirements. So, I don't think there's a concern about somehow the firm would be mismanaged. Clearly, under SEC rules, there's a sanctity of the charter for the national bank, and it needs to be, managed with an eye towards the risks to the deposit insurance fund, and its own board has responsibilities. But I don't think there's really a concern that they would take outside risks because their creditors are subordinated effectively to the top-tier holding company's creditors. I don't know if Randy has a view on that. But.
So the question for me was, do I only want bankruptcy to apply to the smaller SIFIs, not to the 6 or 8 big ones? Your intuition is exactly right. I want it to apply to all of them. But the point I was trying to emphasize is Title II is not made for the smaller ones. So bankruptcy should be the main game, maybe even the only game in town for the smaller ones. For the bigger ones, I would love for them to go through bankruptcy rather than Title II. And my objective in all this is to make Title II as unnecessary as possible. I'm not in favor of repealing it, but I think we should make it as unnecessary as possible.
Interesting. I have a question back here.
Ted Murphy from CRS, and I'll just open something up. I'll make a specific question, but take it any direction you want to go. So the Dodd-Frank Act repeatedly in Title II talks about the financial stability of the United States. So for the lawyers, is the little tagline of the United States surplusage or not? And then more generally, the FDIC is out there trying to negotiate with foreign governments on coordinating resolution authority. So what are the issues that you see there in terms of the ability to do this? So for example, the Eastern Europeans have complained if you do single point of entry and you do the subsidiaries, they're going to get screwed. That might be right, it might be wrong, just if you have any thoughts on that.
Interesting question. Of the United States, who wants to take this up?
So
Randy?
it's interesting. Sometimes it's inconsistent. Sometimes the Dodd-Frank Act says of the United States or in the United States, and there's no rhyme or reason to when they use one of those prepositions or the other. It does suggest, though, that the focus is on financial stability in the United States, not in the world. And so, that is probably a constraint on how they can use the SPOE. Which I don't know whether that, I mean, my own view is that one of the criticisms that has been made here consistently, or a thread throughout the criticisms, is the lack of legal certainty in Title II. And like I've written a bunch of things where I've made the same points, and I'd like to see more legal certainty. I'd also like to see legal certainty done by having the FDIC actually issue a policy statement where they actually commit themselves publicly. That was what I thought the notice was going to do that they published. It didn't really do it. But I think that a lot could be done. For instance, I think that there are the foreign regulators who are asking themselves, what will happen to the foreign subsidiary in my jurisdiction if the FDIC invokes Title II to do a single point of entry? And if you read what the Bank of England just published a couple of weeks ago on how it will carry out resolution authority, it goes out of its way of saying that it will carry out its authority in a way that takes into account the impact on foreign jurisdictions, and also will try to do it in a way that minimizes the impact of foreign jurisdictions. The FDIC does not make those kind of statements, and maybe they can't because of this provision in Dodd-Frank.
Very interesting. All right. I want to give Peter and Paul, our principal authors today, a chance if you have any final point, and then we'll conclude.
Just thanks very much for all your thoughtful comments and for reading the paper and for the audience participation. It's very useful. Thanks.
Yeah, I too am really grateful. You've given us a lot to think about. I hope we've given you something to think about. But I am very worried about the idea that we might just go right ahead with this because everyone is for it, and then when we really need it, it's not available because there's some question about the legality. So if you can stimulate Congress to make changes, all the better.
Let's thank our panel for an excellent and very interesting discussion.